I have been asked how I make my very skinny, tiny stems. And so I thought I'd make a little video to show you how. I have traced my stem onto freezer paper. I have traced it onto my fabric, which in this case is batik. I think batik works the best for tiny stems, but it is certainly not required. So I trace it onto the fabric. I remove the freezer paper so I can see what I'm doing. And then I start cutting and stitching. I do not cut seam allowance ahead of time. The reason being it's such a thin, tiny stem that if I cut all the seam allowances, I really wouldn't have any place to put the pins to hold it to the background. So I'm going to start with pinning it in with just a few pins, but notice that I'm pinning on the opposite side of where I'm going to stitch. So, because I'm right-handed, I'm going to stitch from the right to the left, always keeping my thumb perpendicular to the line, my needle parallel to the line. So to begin with, I'm just going to cut a little bit of seam allowance. Just a couple of inches, doesn't have to be very much. And because there are inside curves, I'm going to have to clip just so that I can turn under my edges nice and smooth. So in a deeper curve, I cut more snips, and in a gentle curve, I cut fewer. Okay, so to begin with, I'm going to place my needle behind the applique and come out on the line and then begin to stitch. So I use my needle to turn it under. And I take small stitches close together, trying to come out of the fold each time. I only turn under what my thumbnail can hold. Some people find stitching through batik is rather challenging, and I don't, because I use a John James Golden Glide needle. The Golden Glide needles are coated so that they glide through the batik fabric just like any other needle would glide through any other looser weaved fabric. I'm going to try and get up this one stem so that you can see the magic. Whoops. I apologize for that. Okay, so on this inside curve, I find that the magic swipe does the best job. If I just swipe away, turning under everything, give it a little finger press, then it's already turned under as far as it needs to go. And I can do a fine job on that inside curve. And it's a lot easier to turn it under by swiping it away like this than by trying to chew it with my needle. I say chew because if you work the needle and the seam allowance too much, you're going to get fraying. The needle is going to cause the threads to come apart and the weave to fray. So I try to manipulate the seam allowance as little as possible. So I'm coming up to the end of this particular stem. I'm about to lose my thread. Okay, so here, I'm going to move that pin. Okay, so here we go. Now I'm going to go on the other side. The amount of seam allowance that I cut cannot be any wider than that space right there. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to turn it under. So I'm going to cut a narrow seam allowance. It's because of the tight weave of the batik that I'm able to cut such a narrow seam allowance. I'm going to cut all the way into, but not through the line. And then I'm going to cut some snips so that I can make my inside curve. And then I'm going to begin up the other side. Now the thread is coming out this side. So what I'm going to do is go back in that hole, go through it, and then on this side I'm going to come up in the line as I did to begin with, and then start again. And I want to turn under the line as well as the seam allowance, because the line is part of the seam allowance. Make sure that you turn it all under so that the line doesn't show, because if the line shows, then you have enlarged your piece. And you're trying to make skinny stems, not wider stems. And the more you can turn under, the skinnier they become. Oops. And I'm going to stitch right into that deepest part. The closer I get, the harder it is to turn under the seam allowance. So if I use my needle and push it under and catch it with my thumbnail, then I can stitch it. Try not to lose that. Okay, notice now that I'm on the top. I'm not coming out of fold because there is no fold in the deepest part. And I'm going to take another stitch and kind of wrap that deepest part with thread. Oops, don't want to catch that. And that'll secure it. Then I can start up the other side. So what I do to begin with, notice I swipe that backwards so that I could get it all turned under. And then to begin with, I'm going to go in that same hole, but on an angle. Catch the background, and then I'm going to come out forward. And the reason I do that is because if I just try to start turning, or try to start stitching from underneath the edge in the background, then I will probably cause fraying, cause everything to come out. And this way I caught it all in that first stitch, just by tacking it, by taking that stitch in the same hole as I did before. But so that it doesn't totally come out, I want to go on an angle. And that in essence catches any underneath fabric and then goes into the background. Okay, and that's pretty thin.